Last December, Russia spelled out its demands to US and NATO in a draft treaty. This included demanding an end to NATO's eastern expansion. It also called for Ukraine to be excluded from NATO membership. With this expectation laid down, Russia held 3 separate negotiations with US, NATO, and the OSCE. All of them resulted in stalemates. With US-NATO already in deadlock with Russia, Biden's slip of the tongue may have influenced the new round of escalation. On January 19th, President Biden made a shock statement on Russia-Ukraine tensions.
Russia will be held accountable if it invades, and it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and not do, etc.
This statement immediately sparked a lot of controversy. Did it mean Biden wouldn't take action if it were only a minor incursion? What exactly is a minor incursion anyway? They just go in, ransack a few townships, and make it home in time for happy hour? Not surprisingly, Ukraine's president and foreign minister saw the need to clarify this issue of semantics. Both immediately stated that an invasion is an invasion, whether or not it is a semi-invasion or a small-scale invasion. On top of that, the next day, the White House came in to relay what Biden was really saying vis-a-vis small versus big invasion.
I think what should be clear to everyone, and I think he was very clear on this morning, is that if Russia, if President Putin decides to invade Ukraine, if they move military troops, across the border, that's an invasion, and there will be severe economic consequences.
On January 22nd, tensions were boosted even further via a statement from the British Foreign Office. It stated Russian intelligence agents had contacted a number of former Ukrainian politicians as part of an invasion plan. And the hits just kept on coming. Next, from British Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab. He warned that Russia would face severe economic sanctions if it tried to install a pro-Russian puppet regime in Ukraine. A puppet regime. Can you imagine? As a side note, Raab said that Britain supports Ukraine defending its territorial and sovereign integrity, but it's, quote, highly unlikely that Britain will send troops to the Russia-Ukraine border. The UK's caution to Russia vis-a-vis setting up a puppet government in Ukraine quickly made world headlines. The next sign of elevated tensions came from the US State Department. It ordered the families of embassy employees to evacuate Ukraine this week. It also urged US citizens to leave Ukraine as soon as possible. German media reported similar messaging from the German government, that Germany was ready to evacuate its diplomats from Ukraine. Meanwhile, the military operation is heating up. America's belated Christmas present to Ukraine have arrived. 90 tons of weapons and equipment constituted the first delivery. The second batch weighed in at a not insignificant 80 tons. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken tweeted he endorses Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania's supply of US-made weaponry to Ukraine. This includes anti-tank guided missiles and surface-to-air missiles. The UK and several other NATO countries have begun sending military equipment to Ukraine. A small number of military trainers have also been sent. Germany, on the other hand, has rejected Ukraine's request for arms and ammunition. Then there was a dynamic development to come out of a January 22nd to 23rd Camp David meeting. And when I say Camp David, this isn't just your run-of-the-mill jaunt in the woods, marshmallows and sleeping bags. This is serious negotiations. At Camp David, US Defense Department officials presented Biden with several options for dealing with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. One option would include sending an initial 1,000 to 5,000 US troops to Eastern Europe and the Balkans. If the situation were to deteriorate, then the number of troops would increase tenfold. Warships and military aircraft would be sent. As for the Russian side, tens of thousands of Russian troops have been stationed on the border with Ukraine for months, but Russia has made no obvious tactical moves. Russia apparently has no plans to invade Ukraine. This is what Russian officials have repeatedly affirmed, calling the UK's accusations baseless nonsense. So the military standoff intensifies. At the same time, diplomatic talks have continued. On January 21st, the US and Russian foreign ministers held 90-minute talks in Geneva. At this time, the US agreed to provide a written response to Russia's concerns. Russia signaled that it would base its next steps on this. That response was delivered on January 26th. Antony Blinken delivered a press conference that same day.
Without going to the specifics of the document, I can tell you that it reiterates what we said publicly for many weeks and in a sense for many years, that we will uphold the principle of NATO's open door, and that's as I've said repeatedly in recent weeks, a commitment that we're bound to.
He's basically saying that Moscow's chief request, that is, permanent denial of NATO membership to Ukraine, is off the table. Blinken also said that the written response, quote, sets out a serious diplomatic path forward, should Russia choose it. But I wonder, what path will Russia take if it finds itself backed against a wall? In addition, political advisors from Russia, Ukraine, France and Germany are holding Normandy format talks in eastern Ukraine in Paris. They are discussing how to end the long-running conflict between Ukrainian government forces and pro-Russian separatists. This is in the eastern part of Ukraine. Many point to this as the origin of the current Ukrainian crisis. Others, like veteran investigative journalist Lee Smith, have a different view. Next, we'll examine the key question. Will Russia invade Ukraine, triggering an all-out war between the US, Europe allies, and Russia? Before going into this, though, here's a valuable side note. You've probably heard about the controversial resignation of German Navy Chief Achim Schoenbach. Schoenbach caused a global stir with comments he made on the current Ukraine crisis. What the Russian president wants is to be respected, Schoenbach said at a meeting in New Delhi on Friday.
But what he really wants is respect. He wants, on eye level, he wants respect.
The Navy chief added, describing the idea that Russia wants to invade part of Ukraine as an absurdity.
It is easy to even give him the respect he really demands and probably also deserves.
On top of this, Schoenbach added, the Crimea Peninsula is gone. It will never come back. This is a fact. Naturally, when you're the head of a country like Germany's Navy, you can't very well go around saying what you really believe. Schoenbach's words caused an uproar. He has since voluntarily resigned. Although Schoenbach has more or less apologized for what he said, I think his words strike at the heart of this crisis. They prompt the question, what does Putin need to back down? For one, Russia has repeatedly said that Ukraine cannot join NATO. Putin, beyond that, has a second burning desire. He wants the US and NATO to withdraw their forces in Romania, Bulgaria, and other Eastern European countries. He'd particularly like to see the missiles out of the picture. In other words, Russia needs a geostrategic sense of security. After all, the message of NATO's eastward expansion is that Russia is an enemy. This eastward expansion has seen guns pointed at Russia's doorstep, and there's no buffer zone left. This could explain Russia's hostility at this time. In saying Putin should be given the respect he deserves, Schoenbach means, for one, that there is no need to consider Russia an enemy. There is a far more tried and tested threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. The CCP is not only the prime enemy of India and Germany, but also of Russia. This is the strategic basis for his belief that Germany and India can join Russia against the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, Russia shares a significant strategic interest with Europe and India in dealing with the Chinese Communist Party threat. This judgment is consistent with Russia's public statement that Russia is not an ally of the CCP and its friendship with the CCP is not intended to confront the West. Russia is signaling to the world that it should not treat Russia as an enemy. It's signaling to NATO that it should back off on its eastward expansion. To begin with, it's a safe assumption that if all diplomatic negotiations fail, war is destined to break out. But for this to happen, the strategic interests of both sides would have to be entirely opposed to each other. The situation hasn't reached that stage as yet, though. US, NATO, Russia have not reached so drastic a state of opposition. Then there's the Chinese Communist Party factor to consider again. Putin appears to be extending one hand of friendship to the CCP while pulling a knife on NATO's eastward expansion with the other. The two actions seem conflictual, but the core purpose is really the same. Putin is managing the threat factors of Russia's neighboring regions. It's not in his interest to have these countries become hostile or more hostile towards Russia, especially China. China isn't militarily threatening Russia, so there's no need to make enemies with it. In early January, Russia very quickly sent troops into Kazakhstan. This is another instance of it shoring up its geopolitical security. Here's a second reason why Russia is highly unlikely to invade Ukraine. Ukraine is now better financed and also better weaponized for battle, courtesy of the US and certain NATO countries. So Russia cannot expect to occupy Ukraine as easily as it might have done before. If Russia goes in, it could end up with a rehash of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Compared with that scenario, today's Ukraine is in most respects far exceeding Afghanistan, while the strength of today's Russia in many aspects is less than that of the former Soviet Union. These are points certainly not lost on Vladimir Putin. He wants long-term strategic security. Invading Ukraine, however, could plunge Russia into immediate war, the gains and losses of which are unpredictable. The third and most important reason Russia won't invade also relates to the Chinese Communist Party. There are now years-long tensions between the US and the CCP. This has placed China in a situation of isolation and deterioration on the international stage. Russia's strategy is clear in this. Sit back and watch the two tigers fight while reaping the benefits. Putin has publicly expressed this position. This is the way to maximize Russia's interests. It is also the reason why Putin can elicit a certain degree of strategic dependence from Xi Jinping. The CCP isn't readily going to turn its back and make itself vulnerable to enemies on both sides. Whereas if Putin invades Ukraine, the leverage he has will be lost. The situation would be reversed. It would become a bitter struggle between Russia and the international community. The CCP, meanwhile, would reap the benefits. At the same time, the current friendly relations between Russia and the CCP would be instantly reversed. Russia wouldn't dare to turn its back on the CCP. It would be forced into strategic dependence on the CCP.